You're listening to the Valley Current.
Imagine you have $12.3 billion just sitting in a massive hypothetical vault.
That's a lot of cash.
Right. And if this were, say, 2021, and you were a major Silicon Valley venture capital fund, you'd probably be pouring that mountain of money into, I don't know, the next big cryptocurrency exchange.
Or, a hyper-fast grocery delivery app.
Exactly. Or some revolutionary AI that writes marketing emails for you.
Yeah.
But the world has fundamentally changed because in just the first 5.5 months of 2026, venture capitalists took that exact sum, $12.3 billion, and they didn't buy software to optimize ad clicks.
No, they certainly did not.
They bought autonomous sniper drones, they bought robotic submarines, AI-driven surveillance networks. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's a really profound reallocation of capital. And the speed of it is what truly catches the eye. I mean, that $12.3 billion raised before we even hit June of 2026, it's almost double the amount raised in the exact same period just 1 year prior in 2025.
Double in 1 year.
Yeah, and it actually eclipses the entire 12-month total of 2025, which sat at about $9.95 billion. So we are looking at a financial tidal wave moving in a very specific, very lethal direction.
And that tidal wave is the focal point of our deep dive today. We're unpacking a massive, comprehensive summer 2026 special briefing. It was put together by Computer Law Group LLP, or CLG. It's a deeply researched assessment titled The End of the Peace Dividend: Guns versus Butter, Even-Handed.
It's a brilliant brief.
It really is. And our goal today is to figure out what that $12.3 billion gold rush actually signifies for you, for your tax bracket and for the global economy, because this isn't just a story about wealthy investors chasing the next tech unicorn.
Right.
This money is the financial signature of a complete tectonic shift in global priorities.
Precisely. The core tension we're exploring today is the unwinding of the post-Cold War peace dividend. For over 30 years, the global north has lived in this era where the savings from dramatically lower military spending were essentially redirected towards civilian life.
Right, like health, education, infrastructure.
Exactly. Welfare. In the classic macroeconomic model, that is the butter. The question we're facing now is whether the sudden, massive requirement for new military budgets, the new guns, is going to relentlessly crowd those social budgets back out.
Now, before we start pulling apart the data on defense spending versus social welfare, we really need to establish the ground rules for how we're going to navigate this. Because the moment you start talking about whether a government should fund a missile defense system or a public hospital,
it gets heated.
Yeah, you are stepping into a minefield of deeply held, highly emotional, political, and moral beliefs.
And understandably so, right? I mean, the allocation of national resources is the ultimate expression of a society's values. But our approach today, mirroring the analytical framework of the CLG assessment, is going to be strictly impartial. What's fascinating here is that we're going to examine this trade-off through the objective lens of game theory.
Game theory, historical economics, all of that.
Right. Strategic equilibrium. We are taking absolutely no sides on the political debate. We are not here to argue that rearmament is morally righteous, nor are we here to argue that it's a tragic mistake.
We're just looking at the math.
We're simply examining the mechanics of the trade-off. The geopolitical reality is shifting, the money is moving, and we're going to track exactly how and why that happens.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by tracking the venture capital, because unpacking that $12.3 billion figure reveals some incredibly stark realities about who actually controls the future of defense technology.
It's not a level playing field.
Not at all. The boom is not distributed evenly. Out of that $12.3 billion, a staggering $11.4 billion went strictly to startups headquartered in the United States.
Yeah.
That means roughly 7 out of every 8 venture dollars in this space are landing in America.
It's a striking geographic imbalance. And to understand why American firms are absorbing so much of this capital, you really have to look at the philosophy of what they're building.
Right.
They aren't building traditional heavy armor or, forging steel for aircraft carriers. They are building software-defined autonomous warfare systems.
The ultimate example of this, the elephant in the room, is Endural. We literally cannot talk about defense tech without talking about them. They accounted for nearly half of that entire 2026 venture capital total.
Which is wild.
It is. In May of 2026, they raised $5 billion in a single funding round. That round, which was co-led by Thrive Capital and Andreessen Horowitz, it almost doubled Anduril's valuation to an astonishing $61 billion.
A $61 billion valuation for a company that honestly didn't even exist a decade ago. It's a paradigm shift for the defense industrial base.
Yeah, completely.
The traditional prime contractors, the legacy giants of aerospace and defense, it took them generations to reach those market caps. The market is rewarding Anduril because of their specific focus on autonomy, drones, and sensor fusion.
And they're making real money.
They are. They reportedly generated around $2.2 billion in revenue in 2025. Investors are betting that the future of warfare looks less like a multi-million-dollar missile and more like a swarm of networked, intelligent, relatively inexpensive drones.
Actually, let's pause and explain that shift, because I think it's crucial for understanding these massive valuations. When we talk about AI and autonomy in defense, we aren't just talking about like a remote-controlled airplane.
No, not at all. We're talking about shifting the cognitive load from the human operator directly to the machine itself.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
Well, think about a traditional drone, like the Predators they used in the early 2000s. That required an entire team of human pilots and sensor operators sitting in a trailer thousands of miles away, literally flying it with joysticks.
So it's essentially a very expensive remote control plane.
Exactly. What companies in this new wave are building is true autonomy. You give the system a geographic bounding box and a set of parameters, and the software itself navigates the terrain. It identifies targets using computer vision. It coordinates with other drones in the swarm to execute a mission, all without constant human input.
Wow. And Anduril isn't the only American name pulling in massive capital for this kind of tech. Look at Saronic.
Oh, right, the maritime guys.
Yeah, they focus on autonomous surface vessels, so essentially robotic boats. They raised $1.75 billion in a Series D round led by Kleiner Perkins in March 2026, and that brought their valuation to $9.25 billion.
Massive.
And then there's Shield AI, which focuses heavily on the autonomy software itself, kind of the brain that you can drop into various aerial drones. They pulled in roughly $2 billion also in March.
The overarching theme here is the unmanning of the battlefield. The venture capital isn't flowing into the platforms like the physical metal as much as it's flowing into the software that dictates how those platforms behave collectively.
Okay, so the American market is on absolute fire. But let's look across the Atlantic. Europe is sitting there as a very, very distant second in the finalized numbers. We're talking about just $460 million in completed venture rounds for European defense tech compared to America's $11.4 billion.
Yeah, but to ensure we're representing the data comprehensively, it's worth noting that the European pipeline is not entirely empty.
Fair point.
It's simply lagging in finalized mega-round announcements. There is significant capital in motion.
True. There are big deals pending. You have Germany's Helsing, an AI strike and reconnaissance drone company backed by Daniel X Prima Materia. They're raising $1.2 billion at roughly an $18 billion valuation.
Which is a huge deal.
Huge. Then there's Stark, another German firm founded just in 2024. They're in talks for more than 300 million euros to build loitering munitions, what people colloquially call kamikaze drones. Their valuation is targeting around 2.5 billion euros.
And we also see major growth in European space and maritime defense, like ICEYE, which is a Finnish-Polish satellite firm. They completed a €1 billion raise in June 2026, backed by General Atlantic.
Right.
And that pushed their valuation past 10 billion euros. They essentially quadrupled their worth in just 18 months.
I want to dig into ICEYE for a second, because their technology explains exactly why defense data is becoming so valuable. They specialize in something called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. Why is a radar satellite suddenly worth 10 billion euros?
It comes down to persistence and reliability. You see, traditional surveillance satellites rely on optical sensors.
Like really big digital cameras in space.
Right, incredibly powerful digital cameras. But optical satellites have a massive flaw. They're completely useless when it's cloudy, and they're useless at night. That means for more than half the time, they cannot see the battlefield.
That's a pretty big blind spot.
Exactly. But synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, it worked entirely differently. It doesn't rely on sunlight. It beams its own microwave energy down to the Earth and measures the reflection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this allows it to generate high-resolution images through dense cloud cover, through smoke, and in pitch darkness.
So if an adversary tries to, say, move an armored column under the cover of a storm or hide a supply train at midnight, SAR sees it clearly.
Exactly. It provides 24/7 all-weather persistence. That capability is invaluable to modern military intelligence, which is exactly why the private capital markets are valuing it at 10 billion euros.
Makes sense.
And furthermore, on the maritime front, we're seeing movement with companies like the UK's Kraken Technology. They're raising around $100 million at roughly a $1 billion valuation for autonomous mine hunting vessels. The Royal Navy selected them, seemingly with strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz in mind.
Right, and though I think the data notes there was some conflation in reports between Kraken and the American firm Saronic regarding specific maritime rescue episodes in that region.
Yes, there was a bit of media mix-up there, but the underlying trend holds.
We're also seeing the launch of new dedicated defense funds in Europe, right? Like a 500 million euro vehicle by AVP and Earlybird, and up to $1 billion from Advent International. You even have people like JP Morgan's Daniel Rudnicki-Schlumberger calling this influx of tech the most important change in the way wars are being fought, arguably ever.
But I have to push back on this European narrative.
Okay, let's hear it.
We hear constant rhetoric from European politicians about strategic sovereignty. You know, they want to build a self-reliant defense industrial base so they aren't completely dependent on the United States.
That is indeed a primary stated policy goal of the European Union.
But look at the math. If Europe genuinely wants to build strategic autonomy, can they really do it on a technological supply chain they don't financially control?
That's the $1 million question. Or, well, the $1 billion question.
Right. If American startups are capturing 7 out of every 8 venture dollars in a boom that is defining the next generation of warfare, at what point does Europe's reliance on allied technology become a critical vulnerability? It is the great paradox of the current rearmament cycle, and it requires serious self-reflection from European policymakers. Europe recognizes the geopolitical threat on its borders, obviously, and it recognizes the urgent need to rearm.
Yeah.
But the private capital ecosystem required to rapidly scale these software-defined defense technologies, the risk appetite, the deep talent pools, the massive venture funds, it's overwhelmingly concentrated in Silicon Valley and the broader U.S. market.
It reminds me of someone trying to declare their absolute independence by building a delivery business, but they're renting all their trucks from their neighbor.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Sure, you can drive wherever you want today, and your neighbor is super friendly right now. But what happens if the neighbor suddenly decides they need the trucks back? Or what if they raise the rent? You aren't actually independent. You just have a really good lease agreement.
That analogy captures the structural vulnerability perfectly. If a European nation's autonomous drone swarms are running on American code, optimized by American AI models and funded by American venture capital, the whole concept of European sovereign capability is significantly diluted.
But let's zoom out from the venture capitalists for a second, because VC money, as massive as that $12.3 billion is ultimately just a leading indicator.
Right.
Venture capitalists don't buy drone swarms for their own personal use. They're investing because they see a much, much larger customer getting ready to open its checkbook.
Precisely. The private venture money is simply the echo. The shout is coming from the public sector, from the sovereign governments of the world. And to understand why global governments are suddenly preparing to spend trillions of dollars on these systems, we really have to look at the death of the peace dividend.
The peace dividend. Man, it's a phrase that has defined the global economy for most of my life. It sounds so inherently optimistic, you know, like a financial reward for humanity finally behaving itself.
It does. And the term gained massive cultural and political traction right around 1990. It was heavily popularized by figures like U.S. President George H.W. Bush and U.K. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
I remember that era.
Yeah, it captured a very specific euphoric expectation at the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was dissolving, and the massive existential threat of thermonuclear war between superpowers that had defined global security for half a century was rapidly fading.
The logic is incredibly intuitive. If the big bad wolf is suddenly gone, you don't need to spend half your household income reinforcing the doors, buying guard dogs, and stockpiling ammunition.
Exactly.
You can take that exact same money and spend it on fixing the roof, putting the kids through college, and just improving your actual quality of life.
And the macroeconomic data from this period shows that this wasn't just a political talking point. It was a measurable global reality. For roughly 3 decades, military spending plummeted as a share of the global economy. Globally, military expenditures as a share of GDP fell by roughly half between the 1970 to 1990 period and 2008.
Cut in half. That is an almost unfathomable amount of capital freed up from defense budgets worldwide.
It is. And In European economies, the drop was equally stark, if not more so. Defense outlays across the continent dropped from around 2.5% of GDP in the early 1990s down to about 1.5% by 2014.
Wow.
There's an estimate from the Bruegel think tank that quantifies this perfectly. They estimate that the cumulative European dividend, the total amount of money saved by European nations over those 30 years by keeping defense spending at that lowered rate, was more than 4 trillion euros.
4 trillion euros. I mean, think about what 4 trillion euros can buy. The prevailing narrative is that this massive windfall was directly swapped from the gun side of the ledger to the butter side.
Right.
We took the money we used to spend on battle tanks and stealth bombers, and we poured it into MRI machines, teacher salaries, high-speed rail, universal pensions. We built the modern social safety net on the back of a demilitarized Europe.
That is the popular tidy narrative, yes. But if we're being rigorously analytical, we have to acknowledge that serious economists and historians raise a significant caveat here. The reallocation of that 4 trillion euros was actually much messier and much more complex in reality than a simple one-to-one transfer.
Right, because a national economy isn't a simple seesaw where if you take a 10-pound weight off defense, social welfare automatically goes up by 10 pounds.
Exactly. For instance, if you look at the United Kingdom, military spending as a share of the economy had actually been on a downward trajectory since the 1950s.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That decline had far less to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and much more to do with the long structural realities of decolonization and the shrinking of the British Empire. They were shedding global garrisons for decades.
And what about the other side of the ledger? Health spending exploded over the last 30 years. Was that really funded by the peace dividend, or was that driven by completely separate forces?
It's correlative, but attributing it entirely to the peace dividend is an oversimplification. The explosive growth of health and social spending since 1990 owes a massive debt to basic, unavoidable demography.
Aging populations.
Exactly. Populations in the global north began aging significantly, which inherently drives up pension and healthcare costs.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the medical advances of the last 30 years have been miraculous, but they're also astronomically expensive.
Right.
The baseline cost of keeping a population healthy rose dramatically. So the social spending is going to have to rise regardless of what happened to the military budget.
The peace dividend provided convenient fiscal headroom, sure, but it wasn't a direct, perfectly designed wealth transfer.
Okay, so the accounting might be a bit messy, but whether that 4 trillion euros was perfectly reallocated to schools or just absorbed by an aging population, the ultimate outcome is the same. The receipt has been completely spent.
It has.
The geopolitical holiday is over, the dividend is gone, and now the entire transaction is running in reverse. The world is rearming at a terrifying pace. And this brings us to the analytical spine of our analysis today. To understand why this sudden, massive reversal is happening, we need to apply the game theory concept of the security dilemma and the Nash equilibrium.
Okay, this is where we have to strip away the politics and look at international relations purely mathematically. Break down the security dilemma for us. How does it explain the evaporation of the peace dividend?
At its core, the security dilemma is the tragic paradox of international relations. Imagine two neighboring nations, let's call them Nation A and Nation B. Neither nation actively wants a war. They both want peace and prosperity for their citizens.
Seems reasonable.
However, Nation A looks at the world, feels a slight sense of vulnerability, and decides to build up its military just a little bit, purely for defensive purposes, just to be safe.
Which is a completely rational move for any leader trying to protect their people.
It is. But here's the dilemma. To Nation B, Nation A's quote-unquote defensive buildup doesn't look defensive at all. Nation B cannot read Nation A's mind. All Nation B sees is their neighbor buying more tanks and training more troops.
So they panic.
Right. From their perspective, it looks like a threat. It looks like preparations for an attack. Therefore, Nation B feels compelled to arm itself in response, purely to maintain the balance of power.
Which, of course, Nation A immediately perceives as an escalation, confirming their initial fear that they were vulnerable, so they build up even more, and the spiral begins.
Exactly. This dynamic relentlessly drives both nations toward mutual arming, even if neither initially wanted a conflict. In game theory, this state of mutual arming becomes the Nash equilibrium.
The Nash equilibrium.
Yeah, established by mathematician John Nash in 1950. It's a state in a game where no single player can gain an advantage by changing their strategy unilaterally, assuming the other player's strategies remain unchanged.
Let me make sure I understand this. If both nations just agreed to stop building weapons, they would both save billions of dollars. They would be mutually better off. But they can't do that, because the moment Nation A puts its weapons down, Nation B has a massive, potentially existential advantage. So the rational, self-interested choice for both players is to keep spending money on weapons, even though it completely drains their wealth.
Precisely. It is the structure of a classic prisoner's dilemma played by sovereign states on a global stage. In this game theory framework, the 30-year peace dividend we just discussed wasn't a permanent evolution of human nature. It was simply the cooperative payoff of a very specific, very rare strategic equilibrium that existed right after the Cold War. The geopolitical threat was genuinely low, one superpower was dominant, and therefore mutual restraint actually worked.
But the underlying matrix of the game moved. The historical conditions changed.
They did.
Yeah.
We can point to two massive structural shocks to the international system: the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Those two events violently shifted the payoff matrix. The geopolitical environment signaled that restraint was no longer safe.
It broke the spell.
Completely.
Yeah.
The equilibrium slid rapidly away from cooperation and locked firmly back into mutual arming. The guns versus butter allocation is not a fixed moral feature of a society. It's a fluid choice whose payoffs shift based on the threat environment.
It's exactly like a neighborhood watch program. Imagine you live in a house and you've been paying $200 a month for this incredibly elaborate, state-of-the-art home security system.
Okay.
But over the years, the neighborhood becomes incredibly safe. Nobody has been robbed in decades. So you make a totally rational choice. You cancel the expensive security subscription and you use that extra $200 a month to boost your kid's college fund.
A perfectly logical reallocation of resources to maximize your family's welfare.
Right. You are enjoying your own personal peace dividend. But then out of nowhere, 3 houses down the street get broken into. And a month later, the house right next door gets vandalized.
The threat matrix has changed.
Suddenly, you have no choice. You have to call the security company and get the expensive system reinstalled immediately. But here's the problem. Your kids are still going to college. The tuition bill is still due. Now you got to figure out how to pay for the security system and the college fund at the exact same time.
And the sheer scale of the public sector pivot to reinstall that security system is breathtaking. The data proves that the security dilemma is in full accelerating effect globally. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, released a comprehensive report in April 2025 detailing the spending trends for 2024.
What did it find?
They documented that world military expenditure reached an all-time record of $2.7 trillion in a single year.
$2.7 trillion in 1 year. The numbers are almost too large to visualize.
And the absolute total is actually less important than the trajectory. That $2.7 trillion represents a 9.4% real terms jump from the previous year.
9.4%.
Yes. That is the steepest year-on-year rise in global military spending since at least 1988, which puts us right back at the frantic end of the Cold War. The global military burden climbed to 2.5% of total world GDP, and per capita military spending hit its highest level since 1990.
And it is crucial for you, the listener, to understand that this isn't just a one-off panic spend because of a single news cycle. Global alliances are actively locking these massive financial commitments into law for the next decade.
Right.
Look at the NATO summit held at The Hague in June 2025. NATO members officially committed to spending 5% of their GDP on defense and broader security by 2035. 5%. For years, the guideline was a mere 2%, and half the alliance dragged its feet trying to even hit that baseline. Now they're targeting 5%.
It is a staggering structural shift in fiscal policy. And that 5% target is actually quite nuanced. It breaks down into a requirement of 3.5% on core traditional defense capabilities and an additional 1.5% dedicated to broader security infrastructure, cyber resilience, and rapidly expanding the defense industrial base. NATO has even scheduled a formal review for 2029 to enforce progress on these targets.
And the European Union, independent of NATO, is mobilizing its own massive pools of capital. They introduced a joint white paper in 2025 for a mobilization envelope called Rearm Europe, or Readiness 2030. The goal is to mobilize up to 800 billion euros.
Let's examine the mechanics of that EU mobilization because it really demonstrates how deeply this pivot is penetrating financial institutions. That 800 billion euro envelope includes proposals for a 150 billion euro safe loan instrument.
What exactly is that?
Essentially, this is specialized, EU-backed public financing designed to rapidly inject liquidity into the European defense supply chain. It allows defense contractors to dramatically scale up production lines without taking on ruinous commercial interest rates. We're talking about hundreds of billions of euros being materialized through complex financial engineering specifically for defense capability.
But the most shocking shift, the absolute clearest signal that the post-Cold War era is dead, happened in Germany. In 2025, Germany actually amended its constitutional debt brake to legally exempt defense spending.
For listeners unfamiliar with German fiscal policy, it is impossible to overstate what a massive cultural and political earthquake that is.
It's unprecedented.
It is. Germany's post-war identity has been deeply defined by two things: a profound aversion to militarization and strict, almost dogmatic fiscal orthodoxy. The debt brake was designed to prevent the government from running structural deficits. To create a constitutional carve-out to borrow billions of euros specifically for the military shows just how deeply the Nash equilibrium has shifted back toward rearmament.
Okay, the reality is set. The global security system is being reinstalled. The $2.7 trillion has been spent. The 5% NATO targets are locked in. The venture capitalists are throwing their $12.3 billion at defense startups because they can clearly see the public sector checkbook opening wide.
Exactly.
Which leads us to the absolute core of our analysis and the most fiercely debated, highly emotional economic question of our time: the guns versus butter trade-off.
And here, we must reiterate our absolute commitment to strict impartiality. We're going to ask whether this massive rearmament will inevitably crowd out health, education, and welfare spending.
Right.
To do this, we are going to present the academic literature, the historical precedent, and the hard data for both sides of the argument. The economic evidence is genuinely mixed, and anyone who tells you that the question is definitively settled in one direction or the other is severely overstating their case.
Let's start with the instinctive, almost visceral argument that most people feel immediately: the case for crowding out. Economists call this the doctrine of opportunity cost. The idea is incredibly simple to grasp. Every single euro or dollar or pound spent on a loitering munition is a piece of currency that physically cannot be spent on building a new hospital ward, paying a public school teacher, or funding a retiree's pension.
It is the fundamental reality of a finite national budget. A government budget is not an infinite resource. It's a defined pool of capital. If a government decides to dramatically expand the allocation for the defense ministry, and it cannot endlessly raise taxes or borrow infinitely without crashing its currency, it must reduce allocations elsewhere.
We don't have to rely on theoretical whiteboards to prove this. We have a live documented swap that happened recently in a major G7 economy. In February 2025, the United Kingdom government announced it was going to raise defense spending toward a target of 2.5% of GDP. And to help fund that military rise, they explicitly publicly cut their overseas aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3% of their gross national income.
That drop to 0.3% represents the lowest level for UK overseas aid since 1999. It was such a direct, zero-sum swap between security and humanitarian spending that the responsible development minister of the UK government actually resigned in protest.
Wow.
Yeah. Even Pride, the Peace Research Institute we mentioned earlier, cited this specific episode as a textbook example of governments directly redirecting funds from other established national priorities to feed the military budget. It is the opportunity cost made manifest in public policy.
Okay, a minister resigning over an aid budget is a great dramatic headline. But is that just a one-off political stunt in one country, or is there actual hard math proving that buying weapons physically drains domestic social budgets? What does the broader academic data say?
The macroeconomic data strongly supports the crowding out theory, particularly in specific fiscal environments. There's a landmark 2023 study published in the journal Quality and Quantity that analyzed budget data from 116 countries over a 17-year period from 2000 to 2017.
That's a massive data set.
It is. And this massive data set revealed that military spending does indeed displace government health spending. Crucially, the researchers found that this displacement effect is highly concentrated in states that are fiscally constrained. meaning middle and low-income nations that do not have the luxury of vast borrowing capacity.
So if a country's national budget is already incredibly tight, buying fighter jets absolutely, mathematically means buying fewer vaccines and building fewer medical clinics.
Precisely. The trade-off is immediate and brutal. This is corroborated by another piece of research focused specifically on the developing world, a 2026 study by Badmus, Raifu, and Balogun focused on Africa. Their modeling estimated that a 10% rise in military spending is directly associated with a roughly 0.40% fall in government health expenditure.
Almost 0.5% drop in health for every 10% in military.
Right, and the cascading effect of that is a consequent rise in out-of-pocket medical costs for everyday citizens.
Think about that from the perspective of a taxpayer. The government decides it needs a new missile system, the government budget shifts, the public health clinic loses funding. And suddenly, when you get sick, you are paying out of your own pocket for medicine that used to be subsidized. The guns literally eat the butter.
Even in wealthier nations, the evidence of displacement exists, though it is slightly more complex. A comprehensive review by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences concluded that while the evidence on military spending directly displacing broad health and education budgets is somewhat mixed in rich countries, there is much clearer, more consistent evidence that defense spending displaces direct financial transfers and welfare programs for the poorest citizens.
So the crowding out case is robust, it's logically intuitive, and it's backed by empirical data, especially when government budgets are tight. It seems like a closed case. But I know there's a massive counter-argument here, and it's not just the grim argument that we need defense so we have to suck it up and accept worse schools. It's actually a much more provocative, almost counterintuitive claim.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is one of the most fascinating paradoxes in political economy. The serious historical countercase argues that warfare hasn't historically shrunk the welfare state. It actually built it.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Are you saying that going to war, dropping bombs, and spending billions on armies is what actually created the modern social safety net? How does that logic possibly work?
Let's test that theory against the historical record, particularly in Western democracies. The data shows that eras of mass mobilization warfare were often the direct catalysts for expanding, not dismantling, social welfare programs.
Give me an example of how a war built a welfare program.
Look at the United Kingdom. The foundational blueprint for the entire modern British welfare state is the Beveridge Report. It was a massive document that targeted what it called the 5 giants plaguing society: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It proposed universal social insurance, health care, and family allowances. Do you know what year that revolutionary social document was published?
1942. Right in the absolute thick of the Second World War. London was being bombed, the military budget was astronomical, and yet government was designing the most expansive social welfare program in its history.
Exactly. And the National Health Service, the NHS, the absolute crown jewel of the British welfare system, opened its doors in 1948, barely 3 years after the most destructive war in human history ended. The massive national insurance systems were forged directly in the crucible of that conflict.
And we see the exact same pattern in the United States. Look at the GI Bill of 1944. That legislation was passed while millions of Americans were literally fighting overseas. It provided unprecedented benefits: paid college tuition, low-cost mortgages, unemployment compensation for returning veterans. That single piece of wartime legislation sent a massive generation to university and into home ownership. It essentially built the modern American middle class.
The social mechanism behind this paradox is documented brilliantly by scholars like Richard Titmuss in his 1958 work War and Social Policy, and more recently in the 2018 book Warfare and Welfare by Obinger, Peterson, and Stark. When a state requires mass mobilization, when a government has to ask millions of its working-class citizens to risk their lives in a total war and ask the civilian population to endure severe rationing and bombing, it is forced to build a profound social solidarity.
It's an unwritten social contract.
Precisely. The state essentially has to promise its people a significantly better, more secure, more equitable life in return for their ultimate sacrifice. The shared trauma and shared sacrifice of total war built a political consensus for universal social provision and heavy taxation that simply did not exist and likely could not have been forged in peacetime.
It's an incredible thought. The shared trauma of war forced governments to actually take better care of their people. And it wasn't just social policy that got a massive wartime boost, it was technology too. The spin-off record of military research and development bleeding into civilian life is undeniable.
Yes. The technological spillovers represent a massive civilian dividend generated by military budgets. Consider the U.S. Defense Research Agency, DARPA. Defense funding is directly credited with seeding the early architecture of the Internet. It built the Global Positioning System, or GPS, which guides our global logistics and our civilian smartphones every single day.
Oh, absolutely.
The Defense Department even provided critical early-stage funding for the fundamental technology behind mRNA vaccines. Furthermore, modern defense spending often functions as massive disguised industrial policy. It drives the reshoring of manufacturing, builds supply chain resilience, and creates sovereign technological capabilities that have immense cascading economic benefits for civilian industries.
In underlying all of these arguments against the crowding out theory underneath the GI Bill, the NHS, and DARPA is the most brutal, simple truth of geopolitics. Security is the absolute precondition for any social spending whatsoever. As the analysis bluntly puts it, an undefended state funds no hospitals at all. If your nation is conquered, your welfare state ceases to exist. Security isn't competing with butter. Security is the refrigerator that keeps the butter from spoiling.
It is the ultimate trump card in the debate. Without sovereignty, social policy is irrelevant. However, true to the even-handed nature of our analysis, having presented the historical warfare to welfare link, we must introduce the massive modern caveat to this theory.
Right, because as much as I love the historical parallel of the GI Bill building the middle class, I have to look at the reality of 2026. Warfare today looks fundamentally different than warfare in 1944. Back then, you had millions of drafted human soldiers who came home, formed massive voting blocks, and demanded that social safety net. But today, we just spent the first 20 minutes of this deep dive talking about a $12.3 billion venture capital rush into AI, autonomous vessels, and drone swarms.
Exactly. The nature of conflict has transformed. Today's wars and the preparations for them are intensely capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. They are fought with silicon, algorithms, advanced manufacturing, and venture capital. They are not fought by mass conscript armies of everyday citizens.
So here's the critical question. Does the historical warfare to welfare link still hold up if the public isn't being drafted? If modern welfare was built by rewarding millions of human soldiers for their sacrifice, what happens when your new army is made of code and carbon fiber?
It's a profound shift.
Right. You don't have to pay a pension to an autonomous drone. You don't need to offer a GI Bill to a loitering munition. Where does the intense political pressure for social solidarity come from if machines are doing the fighting?
That is the great looming unknown of modern political economy. The historians who meticulously documented the warfare to welfare link of the 20th century themselves heavily doubt that the phenomenon will repeat today. The specific social mechanism that turned drafted soldiers into a unified voting bloc demanding social insurance may simply not be present in an era of autonomous, software-defined warfare.
Interesting.
The uncertainty regarding this dynamic, rather than a confident historical parallel, is the honest state of the question.
It really puts a pin in the optimistic idea that we can just rely on the side effects of a military buildup to sort out our civilian social budgets, which brings us back to the current reality and that massive $12.3 billion pile of venture capital.
Back to the VC money.
Exactly. If we accept that this money is flowing because the public sector is rearming, we still need to look critically at the market itself. Is this $12.3 billion VC rush a healthy, sustainable market? Or are we looking at the defense tech equivalent of the pets.com bubble from the year 2000?
There are sharply competing market viewpoints on exactly this question within the financial sector. Unsurprisingly, the beneficiaries and architects of the current boon are highly confident. Shawna Milani from Advent International is on record insisting that the underlying geopolitical driver is permanent, stating emphatically that this is not a hype.
Naturally.
Yeah, and Florian Heinemann of Project A argues that the seemingly astronomical valuations don't actually look crazy when you realize that these startups have real, massive, locked-in order books from sovereign governments.
But the skepticism is definitely there, and it's coming from industry veterans who know how hard it is to actually scale defense manufacturing. Thomas Pruess from DTCP called the market super busy, but explicitly warned it might be significantly overheated in specific trendy corners, like aerial drones. And then you have a truly grounding perspective from Armin Paperger. He is the chief executive of Rheinmetall, which is a massive traditional European defense contractor that builds tanks and artillery. At a recent London defense show, he bluntly stated that he is personally not convinced the drone business is anywhere near as big as the venture capitalists think it is.
Yep. And Paprika's reasoning is based entirely on the brutal realities of unit economics. He noted that short-range, disposable drones now cost on the order of just €1,000 each.
Let's unpack the actual mechanics of a 1,000 drone versus a traditional defense product. Because think about it, right? If you are Rheinmetall selling a main battle tank, you are selling a multi-million-dollar platform. You then secure decades of revenue from maintenance, upgrades, specialized training. It's a massive, sticky revenue stream.
The phenomenal business model.
But if your core product is a plastic autonomous drone that costs less than a used laptop and its entire purpose is to fly into a target and explode, how do you build a sustainable $60 billion business on that?
That is precisely the structural hurdle. When the unit cost of your primary product collapses that precipitously, and the product is inherently disposable, building a multi-billion-dollar recurring revenue business becomes incredibly difficult, no matter how high the volume is. It requires selling millions of units constantly just to maintain the valuation.
And hanging over this entire venture capital rush threatening all of those unit economic models is one massive structural geopolitical risk. Much of the revenue thesis that currently justifies these $60 billion or $10 billion valuations assumes that the intense high attrition war in Ukraine continues indefinitely.
That is a critical, sobering insight for capital markets investors. A sudden geopolitical shift, such as a negotiated ceasefire in Ukraine, could violently deflate these valuations practically overnight. The immediate desperate demand for thousands of autonomous loitering munitions per month might simply evaporate.
Pop goes the bubble.
Exactly. Distinguishing between a durable, long-term structural shift in Western defense procurement and a short-term conflict-contingent hype cycle is the primary defining challenge for investors in this space right now.
So what does this all mean? Let's assume the structural shift is real and governments are going to keep buying. Even then, there's a deeper, almost philosophical critique of venture capital's role in national security. It's an issue referred to as the capital stack mismatch.
This is perhaps the most sophisticated, nuanced market critique we can examine today. It argues that the fundamental, foundational business model of venture capital is fundamentally misaligned with the actual operational needs of a national defense industrial base.
Let's break down how VC actually works. The venture capital playbook, as we all know from watching Silicon Valley for the last 20 years, is entirely built on the winner-take-all outcome. A VC fund invests in 10 companies, fully expecting 8 or 9 of them to go bankrupt. But the strategy relies on that one surviving company becoming an absolute dominant monopoly that crushes all competition and returns 100x on the investment. Think about Google for search or Amazon for e-commerce. Venture capital demands market dominance.
Correct. But a national defense supply chain requires the exact opposite of a single dominant point of failure. It requires deep redundancy. It requires geographic and corporate resilience. If you have only one supplier for a highly specialized drone motor because that startup used VC money to undercut and bankrupt all their competitors, and then that single supplier's factory goes offline due to a cyber attack or a supply chain shock, your nation's military capability is instantly crippled. Monopolies in defense procurement are an unacceptable national security risk.
Which means the typical VC equity model, forcing companies to scale aggressively and destroy competitors, might actually be damaging to the broader, fragile industrial base. Most of the critical firms that actually make the vital nuts and bolts, the specialized optics, the raw materials, the specific micro-components of these autonomous systems are not sexy startups.
Oh, they're not.
They're long-established, medium-sized family businesses. They do not need expensive, highly dilutive venture equity that forces them to chase unnatural hypergrowth.
What those vital supply chain firms actually need is patient debt and steady growth capital. They need standard commercial bank loans to buy new CNC machines. They need private equity geared towards slow, steady, resilient growth. They need support from institutional investors to methodically scale up their factory lines without taking on the toxic pressure of returning a 10x multiple in 5 years. The whole capital stack, the different types of financing available in a market, it needs to align with the specific needs of the industry. And hyper-aggressive venture capital is only a tiny, highly specialized sliver of what a healthy defense ecosystem actually requires.
And thankfully, we are seeing major financial institutions realize this mismatch. The European Investment Bank, the EIB, is reportedly tripling its intermediated financing specifically directed at defense suppliers. Policymakers are even floating the idea of creating a dedicated security and resilience bank. The entire goal would be to provide this kind of steady, boring, non-venture funding to keep the middle of the supply chain robust.
It highlights a genuine, massive opportunity in the underserved middle of the market. There's a desperate need for debt and growth financing for the component and supply chain firms that the high-growth venture model simply neither fits nor reaches.
Okay, we've covered a massive amount of ground. We've tracked the venture capitalists, we've analyzed the shifting strategies of defense contractors, we've walked through the game theory of the security dilemma, and we've debated the historical economics of guns versus butter. But now we got to pull all of these threads together to face what the analysis calls the ultimate squeeze.
The squeeze. Because
the reason this debate is so highly charged, so incredibly tense for governments in 2026, isn't just because the military budget is demanding 5% of GDP. It's because the butter, the civilian social state, is becoming astronomically expensive at the exact same time.
This is the deepest, most intractable constraint of all. It is what makes the current era of rearmament fundamentally mathematically different from previous periods like the 1980s Cold War buildup. The core constraint today is heavily demographic, and it is brutally fiscal.
Let's look at the demographics first, because you can't argue with math and biology. Western populations almost across the board are aging rapidly, birth rates have fallen, and life expectancies have risen. That is an inescapable biological fact. And what does a heavily aging population mean for a national budget? It means healthcare costs are rising exponentially. It means pension obligations are ballooning.
And critically, those massive civilian costs are legally and politically locked in. They are going to accelerate regardless of what happens with defense procurement, regardless of what happens on the front lines in Ukraine, and regardless of tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. The baseline cost of simply maintaining the existing social state is accelerating rapidly.
And then you have to combine that accelerating demographic cost with the massive fiscal hangover of the last few years. We're not starting this global rearmament process with clean, healthy national balance sheets. Post-COVID sovereign debt levels are staggering. Governments borrowed trillions to keep their economies afloat during the pandemic. We're looking at France sitting at public debt levels around 112% of their GDP. Italy is hovering near 135%.
The fiscal reality is dictated by grim arithmetic. The financial room to fund a massive high-tech rearmament program hitting that mandated 5% NATO target while simultaneously continuing to fund a heavily utilized growing social state simply by borrowing more money is completely finite.
You just run out of road.
Exactly. The bond markets will not absorb infinite debt without demanding crippling interest rates, and the political appetite for raising civilian taxes to fund both massive rearmament and massive pensions is extremely limited.
So we are looking at a very divergent future depending entirely on where you live and how healthy your national balance sheet is. Germany, as we discussed earlier, radically changed its constitution to exempt defense spending from the debt brake. They're attempting what is referred to as a twin fund model.
Right.
They're attempting to fund massive defense procurement through specialized borrowing while desperately trying to keep their existing 500 billion euro infrastructure and civilian social funds completely intact, specifically to avoid forcing a direct, painful guns for butter swap on their citizens.
Germany, despite its recent economic challenges, historically has the vast fiscal space and the borrowing credibility to at least attempt that complex maneuver.
Yeah.
But many of its geopolitical neighbors simply do not. High-debt states, those nations without the macroeconomic capacity to endlessly issue new bonds, are going to face a brutal, direct, zero-sum trade-off.
It's the even-handed core of the entire matter. The ultimate question isn't whether national security is worth paying for. We've established through the security dilemma and historical precedent that it plainly is. Security is the foundation upon which everything else is built.
Absolutely.
But the cold, hard arithmetic question is, can a society simultaneously fund next-generation military deterrence, care for a rapidly growing population of aging citizens, and invest heavily in the education and infrastructure of its youth without one of those priorities violently crowding out the others?
And the sobering conclusion of the analysis is that, based on current demographic and fiscal arithmetic, some nations will manage to balance it through immense economic growth, and many others will simply not. The displacement of social spending by military necessity will happen exactly where fiscal space is the tightest.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the final takeaways from this comprehensive assessment are crystal clear. We need to collectively stop viewing the 30-year peace dividend as some sort of permanent, enlightened moral victory for humanity.
It was a temporary geopolitical holiday. It was the cooperative payoff of a specific vanished equilibrium, a macroeconomic bet on the existential threat staying gone forever. But history inevitably returned, the security dilemma aggressively rearmed, and now the financial bill for that 30-year holiday is finally arriving.
The honest, mathematically sound forecast isn't that the modern welfare state is going to be completely gutted and dismantled overnight everywhere, but the direct trade-off between civilian comfort and national security is undeniably real again. Its resolution is going to vary wildly, country by country, depending entirely on their specific fiscal space and the difficult political choices their citizens are willing to make.
We have to closely watch the macroeconomic benchmarks over the next few years. Watch the 2029 NATO review of the 5% targets. Watch the individual national budgets of the major European powers.
What are we looking for specifically?
Will we see sustained core defense spending aggressively pushed above 3.5%, accompanied by real, painful cuts to health and education, especially in high-debt states like Italy or France? Or will we see a delicate coexistence, with rising defense budgets alongside maintained social spending funded entirely by unexpected surges in technological growth?
A sudden sovereign debt stress event in Europe would force this entire trade-off out into the open immediately. The numbers wouldn't be able to hide behind deficit spending anymore. The choices would become absolute.
Indeed. We are entering a period of profound macroeconomic uncertainty, driven entirely by undeniable geopolitical necessity.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one specific thought to mull over. Think about your own paycheck, your own taxes, and your own future. We've talked extensively today about the sheer mind-boggling cost of everything coming down the pike. Think about the aging populations we just discussed. If a society cannot afford to fund its military deterrence, its elderly, and the education of its youth all at once, who should bear the shortfall? And more importantly, should that choice be made by the financial markets, by fiscal rule books, or by you, the voters? It's a question we'll all be answering in the decade to come. Led by Jack Russo, Computer Law Group LLP is a bespoke business litigation and founder-friendly boutique law firm with offices and licensed attorneys in Silicon Valley, New York, and Tampa Bay. And you can reach Jack at computerlaw.com and his team at www.computerlaw.com, where the newsletter we referred to is published in detail and readily available, commitment-free, with no paywalls or other charges.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.